I'm thrilled to be moderating this fireside with my colleagues and my friends, Sarah, Mariama, and Jennifer, and talk to you all about domestic violence. The four of us have all known each other and worked together at some point over the last decade at an incredible domestic violence organization in New York City, Sanctuary for Families. So it was the amazing work at Sanctuary that led me to pursue my doctorate and to conduct research to look at ways to support survivors of domestic violence with diverse identities and experiences in the aftermath of violence. So some of my recent research projects have looked at the use of neuroscience and mindfulness, trauma-informed practice, and intersectionality, and also employment interventions and virtual service responses during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm honored to be alongside these remarkable women, and not only are they tremendous advocates and leaders in the field, but they're also committed to providing innovative and cutting-edge services that address the complexities of domestic violence today. And just a note on terminology, I use the term domestic violence, but there are many other terms. So intimate partner violence, violence against women, gender-based violence, they're often used interchangeably, but there's some slight differences depending on the context. But they all fall under the umbrella term gender-based violence. And terminology, of course, is important. Some people identify as victim, others as survivors, and then some move back and forth between these two terms. And I also wanted to take a moment to address and to note that talking about domestic violence can be very difficult. It can also be triggering, especially for those who are currently in a domestic violence situation, or if any of your loved ones are experiencing violence as well. So at the end of our fireside discussion, we'll be providing some resources and more information for help. So just to get to some of the basics around domestic violence and some definitions, domestic violence is a pattern of behavior in any relationship, so including married or dating partners, that's used to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. There are different forms of abuse: physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological, and they all include either actions or threats over another person. So these are often behaviors that frighten, intimidate, humiliate, or injure or hurt somebody. Domestic violence can happen to anyone at any time, of any race, age, ethnicity, culture, religion, sexual orientation, and across all socioeconomic backgrounds. Domestic violence can also vary in how often it happens and also how severe it is. It can range from one episode of violence to chronic and severe episodes over multiple years. And domestic violence impacts nearly 1 in 3 women. That's the statistic that we hear all the time, but also 1 in 9 men as well. And then these rates are even higher in the LGBTQ plus community, especially among bisexual women and trans women too. And then the most dangerous time for a woman to leave an abusive relationship is when she's pregnant. So very sensitive and delicate time. And also when she's telling the abusive partner that she's leaving, and then during the first 2 years after she's left. So people often ask, why did she stay? Why didn't she leave? Well, it's complicated. And this is what we'll be discussing more on that today. But people stay for many reasons. They stay for the children in hopes that their partners might change. For financial reasons, that's a really big one. And then one of the main reasons that people do stay is for love. So domestic violence is pervasive and it's prevalent and it's been around for a very long time, but it's also very preventable, which we'll also discuss. And there's been great strides over the last several decades. In the 1970s, the battered women's movement brought domestic violence out of the shadows of people's homes and into the forefront of society. Survivors and advocates opened the first shelters, nonprofits, legal services, and counseling services. And today, service providers continue to work tirelessly, influencing policies and creating new programs because there's still so much work left to be done. So I welcome this terrific fireside panel of fearless and committed domestic violence advocates to speak more about where we are today and where we hope to go. So I'd like to turn this over now to our speakers to hear a bit more about the work that they do and to speak to the broader context of domestic violence. And I would welcome Mariama to begin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for having me. My name is Mariama, and I am a program director from Sanctuary for Families. So what do? I work directly with survivors of gender-based violence, and that includes, as Sarah was listing all these different types of gender-based violence. It's intimate partner violence. It could be female genital mutilation. It's early forced marriage. It is also labor and sexual trafficking. So I see clients who are still in the abusive relationship, but some of my clients also are no longer living with the abuser. So they have left the abusive relationship, even if they are still dealing with, the consequences of the abuse. So I can see them either in individual counseling or group, and some of my clients, they can do both, group therapy and individual therapy. So something else also I do is community outreach and education on all these issues. So the outreach, it's really targeting not only professionals who are working with the survivors, but also communities where we can meet sometimes with the potential victims. So it's these two groups. And we do a lot of advocacy also at Sanctuary for Families because it's really intertwined. It's impossible to try to support a survivor of gender-based violence without doing policy work and try to really advocate for policy change. We have been advocating at federal level, and I think one of the examples I can give is the Girls Protection Act that was signed into law in 2013 that prevent girls in the United States from going to abroad for the purpose of FGM. But that's just one example. We have many other, policies there that Sanctuary has been involved in. And sometimes advocacy, it can be at a local level, it can be at a city level or a community level to support these survivors so that they can access needed services. One thing I want to highlight, I know, Sarah, you mentioned the numbers around domestic violence, but it is a pandemic. Like domestic violence was a pandemic even before the COVID-19 pandemic, which made it really hard for survivors. And we know research has shown that cases have increased during the pandemic. And I think you also mentioned that, but domestic violence is one of the type of abuse that do not discriminate against gender or race or socioeconomic status, right? It doesn't matter if you are rich or you are not rich or poor. It doesn't matter. I think the only difference I can see between these two groups is the different type of challenges they have to face when they are in an abusive relationship. Someone who has, some financial independency may not deal with crisis related to shelter, right? Because they can't afford renting an apartment or going into a hotel when there is an incident. But someone who doesn't have that financial need can really struggle to access shelter, for example. But that is just some of the challenges survivors may face. But I think when I listen to stories from my client, I'm just going to quote one of my clients who told me a long time ago that she thinks people who abusers, they all graduate from the same school because they have identical tactics. And these tactics, they vary from, intimidation, from manipulating the system, isolation, and blaming the victim or shaming the victim or minimizing the abuse. So these tactics are universal. It doesn't matter, your background. The tactics are really identical. I think I'm going to stop here now, but I'm happy to get follow-up questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariama. That's great. And I think when you brought up this idea of the similar tactics, I think that's a really important point to highlight and to illustrate, and we'll definitely come back to that. And at this point, I'll welcome now Jennifer to also provide some context of the work that she does, and as well as some of the broader challenges and important aspects in her work.
Thank you. Thanks, Mariama. So nice to be here and see everybody. So often the first step for people that we sometimes hear about on the news or on television might be calling a hotline. But calling a hotline isn't the end of the path. It's really just a beginning. It doesn't mean the problem is solved. It is an incredibly valuable step, but often the step for the next chapter. So if there's a crisis going on when someone calls a hotline, or if there's danger, the hotline can play a key role in activating a safety plan. But if someone isn't yet ready to leave, the hotline might just offer a connection to psychotherapy or counseling with someone like me or my colleagues here on this panel. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I work both in private practice as well as in human rights settings with immigrant survivors of gender-based violence who are seeking asylum based on that gender-based violence as a form of persecution. So two very different experiences in my work, but both focus on addressing reactions to stress and trauma and on helping my clients find their voice and telling their story. So if any of you have engaged in therapy, you know firsthand that it works on multiple levels. And sometimes, you think it's working one way, but it's also working in other ways at the same time. So here are some of the ways I think about therapy. I think therapy can validate experiences and emotions. It can help us feel heard and held by another person who cares and values us. Therapy can help us gain new perspectives on how we're thinking, some distance on our thoughts, and how we think about things or interpret situations and where those interpretations come from, basically how we make meaning of what happens to us. Therapy can help us learn alternative ways of making meaning, which begins with alternative ways of thinking or perceiving or perception, right? And so therapists might push people to think about whether they like the way they're perceiving something or whether they want to shift and think about it in what might be more adaptive or healthy. And all of this takes time and patience and a lot of practice, because as I think about it and as I describe it, I like to describe it as a habit. Like our thoughts are patterns. These are patterns we develop, and these are patterns that we can shift. So if clients come to me and they're depressed or anxious and they have symptoms of PTSD or what have you, and I'm going to get to the DV piece in a minute, but the first and foremost thing that comes to me is their situation and what's stressing them out, what's bothering them. So if they have really clear stressful symptoms, we're going to address those head on, because once someone is less depressed or less anxious, they're more able to make a move on what they want to accomplish in their life. And then if you layer in domestic violence situations, there are several mental health constructs, or what we call ideas, or like we can think of them as buzzwords, that all of us here like to really pay attention to. Some of them have already been mentioned: shame, self-blame, isolation, and a sense of agency. So as Mariama discussed before, this cycle of domestic violence is a bit strategic and can feel similar across people, but it can be very good at making those caught within its web blame themselves, feel ashamed, feel they are alone, and that they have no options. And that is where the external voice or observer or therapist or friend comes in, right? Because part of the strategy of abusers is to make people blame themselves, feel ashamed, and feel isolated. And also our social stigma around talking about gender-based violence also functions to keep people quiet and to have them feel ashamed and to blame themselves. So in therapy, I try to help people understand the way each of those buzzwords or dynamics works, particular to their situation, right? So I might listen for thoughts of self-blame, and with the client, we might get familiar with the tape that runs through our heads, and then we might begin to try and challenge it. Is that really true? Are you really to blame? What is going on here? And then I might try to offer different ways of thinking, suggest other ways of being, and make way for new patterns of perception to take hold. And again, like patterns, we want to think of them as habits. And just like other habits, patterns of self-blame and shame can be broken down and shifted, and it can take time and multiple iterations, but it can happen. And I want to stress that I think all of us on this call would agree, we are not able to make this happen. We are just a part of the puzzle, right? I can't make this happen. I'm really just someone's coach. But what's important is that the person seeking support can put multiple pieces in place so they can get a movement going and everyone can work together and that person can feel supported as they move forward. So the last piece I want to talk about before I turn it over to Sarah Hayes is social support. So I feel like we kind of throw this word around as a mental health person, I throw this word around. We all talk about how important it is, but in domestic violence, it's really, really important. So what does it mean? Social support, I went sort of Google searching various definitions. It is described as the support provided by other people within the context of an interpersonal relationship, right? So it's what I might give to my colleagues or my friends in our relationship. And it can have a direct role on someone's recovery from stress. Think about sort of disaster relief efforts, right? There's a lot of influx of support and practical measures, but it can also serve as a buffer or a preventive strategy or a protective layer, helping people keep stress levels down and feel supported so that the crisis never happens or they can avert it. And so it can take all of these many forms. And if you feel like you have someone that needs your support, you can give it in the form of obviously practical measures, right? A warm dinner, clothing, childcare. But during that practical support, you can also provide listening and emotional support. And emotional support for me as a therapist, what I like to think of it as is this reflective mirror that comes from the listener back to the speaker, right? The reflective mirror of friends and family, therapists, someone who cares, who notices what's going on, validates and reflects to the victim survivor that they're concerned, that they look stressed, that something might be wrong, something's amiss, not in a pushy, directive, bully way, but like a listening, friend, supportive way. You reflect. And I think when people are isolated, they don't have this reflection. So the isolation continues. And the value of social support is noticing something's wrong and opening up a window to a conversation and then lifting the shame by providing that conversation. And this is how my work and Sarah and Mariama's work all is very similar. And I love this as a network of women. All of you can take part in this network of social support and help people find that mirror that can help them break the cycle and take the first step out. And we'll probably get back to this later because we're going to talk about different choices. But in that talking and in that listening, I try to listen for the sort of the little crevice of where you can put in some options. Like, okay, what is your option here? What are you feeling? And what could you do about that? Even if it's a very small step. So options help people feel agency and a sense of movement and hopefulness. So I'll stop there. I could go on a long time, but I will stop. And now I'll turn it back to you, Sarah Tarshis.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and thanks for giving us
Sure.
some context around counseling and the therapeutic approach to it. It's really helpful, and then bringing up these important issues of shame and stigma, and then the significance of social support. So I'm looking forward to unpacking these some more as we move along. But I want to move it now to Sarah Hayes and to welcome her to talk about her work and some of her experiences and her insight from a very important perspective, looking at the role of employment and financial security.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Sarah Hayes here. I'm the Deputy Director of the Economic Empowerment Program, or EEP for short, at Sanctuary for Families. And my work focuses on economic empowerment for survivors through career development and career exploration. The Economic Empowerment Program at Sanctuary provides advanced office technology skills via Microsoft Office certification, professional development, and literacy skills upgrading. And we offer this training in a group setting, much to Jennifer's point, key to the social support, or I should say a key to a client's, a client or survivor's resilience in the context of this long journey of getting themselves safe is that social support, which is one of the reasons why we offer this training in a group as opposed to offering one-on-one career development services. And while clients go through this program, we provide a guaranteed occupational income of sorts, which is essentially a constellation of supports, including program stipends, professional attire, food supports, a laptop, Wi-Fi connectivity. All of these things help support a client in, managing an effective runway to their ultimate success with respect to job placement. We focus in the program on assisting clients with managing their professional development by addressing any professional skills gaps that they have so that they can effectively shape themselves into a fit for living wage jobs. And oftentimes when we're speaking about survivors, we're not just talking about one person, we're talking about a whole family. And, the program is set in New York City. It's one of the most expensive places to live in all of the world. So living wage jobs are really key to a survivor's success. At the core of the challenge of securing their safety is not just the experience of violence and abuse. It's also their experience of economic instability related to an experience of poverty, whether that poverty is acute or generational, as well as housing instability or homelessness. So in order for them to really establish their safety, really be able to kind of lead a life where freedom from violence is a choice and an option that they can access, the pathway is really financial stability and ultimately their self-sufficiency. I know that was short, but I'm going to leave it there because I feel like I offered a lot.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah, for giving us some context around the significance of employment, the work that you do, and we'll go in a bit more into that, into some of the nuts and bolts of it as we open the conversation up among the four of us. And this is sort of where we're segueing into the second part of the fireside, where it's going to be a bit more of a popcorn style, where I have some questions that I'm going to put forward, and then we'll kind of go back and forth and share our different insight on these important issues. And I think what's come up between the three of you is this real significance of support and network and building community. And Jen mentioned a bit about the significance of therapy and one-on-one counseling. And I thought I would broaden up a little bit to talk about community and kind of flag, and maybe Sarah Hayes, I'll start with you, but the importance of building community among survivors who've shared similar experiences and what that looks like.
Definitely. I think if there's one thing that probably all of us on this panel have heard, which is kind of staggering because you hear it from many a survivor, is this parallel experience of feeling completely isolated in their experience of abuse. And with as many clients as I've had who have recommended other individuals who are survivors of violence, you would think that that would be enough to demonstrate how this is like a very, very broad issue, even though the experience of it can feel extremely personal, extremely isolating. It can feel like it disconnects you from your family, your friends, a lot of different people. So I think when we thought about that in the design of this program, there was a decision made to specifically serve clients in cohort fashion, right? So currently we start a program with about 60 to 75 clients. Right now, due to COVID, we're delivering the program remotely, but the idea of community and the power of community is still very, very important to us programmatically. So clients gather together, they're able to communicate with one another. And in that process, I think able to dispel some of the fears and anxiety around how you manage this as one person with like the weight of the world and your experience of violence and trauma weighing on you, when even in Zoom, you can like look to the left and see right now a box, not an actual person, but a picture of a person who has also gone through very, very similar things as you. And, that mirroring experience compounds over time as well. As you're going through the easiest parts of the program, the hardest parts of the program, you can always look to someone to your left and to your right and see how they're either managing things well or not and may need some support. And you can either offer that support or be offered support within your community and also from the staff in the economic empowerment program. And, community is the only way that you're able to kind of get that done.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. And I invite Mariama or Jennifer, if you'd like to comment on the role of community or social support. The floor is yours.
I think it's so important to help, survivors of gender-based violence to create that community, because what I have noticed among my clients is, most of the time, the friend they have are friend from the person who's abusing. His family members become the victim's family member. And when they become victims within these communities, they feel extremely isolated. Even in, worship places where people can go and connect with faith leaders, they feel really isolated. And I think creating that community for them that's like why I just feel like running support group is so important for them, because it gives them that community back, not with just someone who can again blame them for what happened, but someone who has a similar experience and can understand and support them. And I think some of these groups, they do keep in touch. Like even after graduating from the group, they share numbers, they visit each other. Some of them live in shelter. When they have an apartment, the first thing they do is to invite like group members. So it's really amazing to do that. And that is possible through, services. So if they come out, if they can seek assistance, this is how they can break the isolation. I think I'm going to pass it to Jen.
I think I'll sound the horn of mental health, and I will say I think there's a real overlap between the isolation of DV, IPV, gender-based violence, but also the isolation that can come with like straight and narrow PTSD or depression, right? If any of us on this call have experienced depression or PTSD, it has this way of making you feel that you are alone in your thoughts, right? And your thoughts slow down, your world becomes smaller, you don't want to go out, you don't take in new stimuli. So there is this real neurotransmitter slowing, as well as a physiological, those like shift into behavioral patterns. So even people who are depressed, not in DV, have a sense that they are alone. And often a signature of PTSD is that no one will ever understand me. No one will understand what I have gone through. And as a therapist, right, I often say that is true that I will never understand exactly what you've gone through, but I think there might be other people who have had some version or who would listen and support you, right? And so it's a delicate balance of helping people see how support groups or group or socializing can help them. But even separate from DV, it's part of a treatment plan to get people connected to others, to help them develop attachment relationships. And so I think the option of reaching out and making connections in support can be healing across the board.
Great. Thank you so much to everybody and to talk about this really significant piece of community and community support, which we know is so essential. And it serves as a buffer against this great isolation that survivors feel. I'm on my own. Nobody else knows what I'm going through. And then when the reality is, no, there are other people that know. There's too many other women who've experienced this too, but this opens up a window and a door and an opportunity to connect with others, which is healthy, which is good. And Jen, you mentioned the significance of trauma. And I think more and more we're hearing, especially in domestic violence, the significance of trauma-informed practice and attending to people's experiences of trauma. And I was curious if anyone wanted to jump in and talk about any of their thoughts around trauma-informed care, if that's something that you might want to share with the group.
Do you want to say what trauma-informed care is, Sarah?
I guess to give some context. I mean, I think for some folks who are working here, I know some people are in education and some people are working in other organizational contexts. There's been a real movement in the last, I'd say 15 or 20 years for this trauma-informed care, trauma-informed approach to services. And like we've known that trauma has existed for a very long time. And I guess trauma as a term first emerged when veterans and war vets were coming back after World War II. And they were really, a lot of soldiers were coming back with very different symptoms and dissociating from their experiences when they were in war and having these flashbacks and nightmares and all these really physiological responses to the experiences that they had. And then as the decades went on, we started to look at trauma in the context of domestic violence and just how profound that impact is on survivors, especially for those who are moving on and trying to get housing or getting a job or moving on with their lives. But often with this experience of trauma can be really detrimental and make it really hard and serve as this larger barrier to heal and to get into a place where I'm feeling like I can move on with my life. So just curious with folks who have worked with clients who are, experiencing trauma firsthand. How does that get in the way of progress and healing and moving forward? And yeah, just curious what folks thought about that.
I can jump in first because I think, interestingly enough, I don't know that I would characterize trauma as the reason why that like life is made difficult for people. I think the fact that so much of us are unwilling to make space for the experience of trauma is what stands in the way, right? And all of us are coming in to our interactions with others with trauma in some form or fashion around something or the other. But our ability, insofar as we can reflect on that and then empathize with others about their situation, is where I see the barrier lying. So when someone does present as, traumatized, there's all this stuff that happens for the person who's receiving and kind of like, developing that perception around that traumatized person that stands in the way. So, and you see it with service provision. Like if you look to many of the systems that survivors have to engage with, if those systems themselves are inherently oppressive, of course, they're going to be triggering to somebody who has experienced a very, very deep experience of oppression and abuse and violence, right? So again, to me, the problem is not the trauma itself. It's that we're engaging with each other in ways that are like inherently harmful. We're accepting of that experience of harm received, we accept the fact that we're kind of like delivering harm and that others are receiving it. And there's very little accountability around how we should be interacting with each other that would either diminish the chance for harm or mitigate the experience of harm or repair the experience of harm. So for that reason, I do believe, because we can't, shifting those systems is a very, very challenging thing, that service provision for survivors has to happen in such a way that you can control for that, which means that you have to be trauma informed. You have to have individuals who are trained to understand what people's response to different stimuli might be due to their experience of trauma. And then, for me, trying to help individuals, become this fit for the professional side, it's like figuring out how to help them navigate the systems that they're going to interact with on the professional side that, aren't always favorable to people who have experienced trauma, so that they can spell their own success, right? Like empowering them to learn the systems, figure out the rules of the game, so that eventually they can be a person who holds more power than they hold now, shaping the way that the systems they engage in are interacting with other individuals who might find themselves in similar positions or different positions, but still kind of like struggling with this experience of being humans who experience trauma and still trying to manage their success as professionals.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. And I like how you're really normalizing this experience and you're connecting it to empowerment and disempowerment, other contexts, and sort of the structural level trauma. So it's really important that we flag these issues. Mariama, Jen?
I will say that I think a lot about trauma-informed care because I work a lot with the immigration system and men seeking asylum in this country. And I consult to lawyers doing this work. And a lot of what I do is I do trauma-informed, I do lectures in law schools and law clinics on how to approach asylum cases with an understanding of traumatic stress, right? And so it requires a paradigm shift for the service provider to not look at people in an accusatory or a questioning or a demeaning way and say like, what's wrong with you, but rather to shift to a place of thinking, oh, what's been happening for you? Tell me your story so I can understand, right? So mentally, you can put behavior and action in context rather than judging it. It's sort of this whole way of trying to even out the playing field between provider and service recipient. So I think about it that way because there's a lot of work to be done in our immigration system in terms of trauma-informed care. But so that's just a kind of an extreme version to highlight what we're kind of referring to here. And the other thing I will say is people who, whether you're an educator or a lawyer or a journalist, right? We talked a lot, now that's a new topic in journalism, trauma-informed journalist practices. But just to have a sense that when you do work with difficult stories, or you do take your friend who's having a really hard time out to coffee, you as a listener, as a recipient of material, are going to be affected by that. And so in order to be your best self, you have to work to take care of yourself so you can be there in your work or as a friend.
I think one thing I want to add is that sometimes the trauma is understood in different ways depending on people's cultures, right? So I think the trauma-informed care for me, I'm not going to add anything on what Jen said about, service providers. This is very clearly defined. But I think the client as well need to be treated like that when you're doing direct services, right? Because they need to understand the concept of trauma. So when they come into me for counseling, they're disclosing that they're not sleeping, they are sad, they're not eating. In some cases, they even cannot put into words the feelings. So something like, I feel like I have a ball in my stomach, right? So I have to find a way to normalize that and connect it to the trauma so they don't think that it's because they're losing their mind or something wrong is happening. So normalizing these feelings, it helps the client understand. And sometimes depending on, the cultures also, like I have a Muslim client, I don't want to schedule them for a therapy session on a Friday while I know Friday is the holy day for that client, right? That's just an example and very small example. So it's understanding a lot the impact of trauma and educating the client, but also understanding the culture of the people we are working with. And if we don't understand, being open to be educated and learn so that we're not harming the people we're working with, right? And I think Jen spoke a little about that, like the sensitivity, the understanding from service providers.
Thank you, Mariama. And you bringing in such an important facet to this is the cultural sensitivity and attending to people's different identities around culture and normalizing it. And these are such important traits in terms of practice. So thank you for contextualizing that. Any other thoughts? Anyone else want to jump in? Sarah or Jennifer? I mean, I have another follow-up question, but just in case there was anything else that you wanted to add.
The point that Mariama made about trauma-informed care really stemming from a respect for intersectionality just was like, whoo, it's a heavy one that we all kind of like should wake up and tell ourselves every single morning, right? That you, and to Jennifer's point about even like the interesting dynamics of like immigration and the legal system and the need to like trauma-informed care even being about leveling the playing field, when so much of this work that we do as service providers, sometimes at the core of it, it's this sense that you're using your power in the service of others. When really, I think trauma-informed care is about the fact that we all want justice. The justice is for all of us. And it's specifically not about the levels that we kind of place between ourselves and the survivors that we're serving, right? So these are just some things that were running around in mind.
And I would like to jump in there, Sarah. I don't know if I'm going to preempt one of your questions, but Sarah, hey, related to that and what Mariama said about culture, I think that question of why don't they just leave is an example of not being trauma informed, right? So I feel, and not being culturally sensitive. And I think even among those of us who've done this work for a long time, you sometimes have that thought like, oh my gosh, what is going on? Like, but you have to check yourself because there's always reasons why it's hard to leave. And there are so many dynamics, and to be really understanding and a good listener and to not judge about why people don't leave, like, whether it's a bad relationship or an abusive marriage or, whatever it is, it can take time and it's complicated. And so I think as we go into this work, it's kind of lining up all the pieces of understanding the different pieces that might go into why people don't leave. The economic piece, I didn't have a father and I really want my kids to have a father. I can't tell you how often I hear that, right? And so you have to really understand, or try to understand, everyone has a different reason. And what you go in thinking might be the reason that they're not leaving, and okay, we're going to work on this, but that might not be their reason. So if you don't ask and you don't work to develop an understanding, nothing's ever going to change.
This is a good point, Jennifer. I think leaving, it is difficult. It's very difficult. And it's something people need to plan. You cannot just pack your things and leave. Because if I go back to the definition of domestic violence that Sarah Tarshis clearly gave us at the beginning of this meeting, it's not very common for DV to start like the next day after getting together. It's a pattern. So within that already there is kind of attachment that is being created there. So the victim, the survivor, becomes so dependent emotionally, financially, and other factors, right? So it's very difficult to break that and just leave. Or the unknown. Like if I think about our immigrant client at Sanctuary for Families, it's so confusing, the system here. Many of them were born like somewhere else. They came here being in an abusive relationship, being isolated. They don't understand the system. So then leaving is so uncertain because they question, if I leave, what's going to happen to me? Where I'm going to go? Who's going to help me? I don't speak well the language. I don't understand. I don't have a stable job. I have 5 children. So it's so many factors behind the fact that people stay. But I think it is very easy for some communities to just bring that, oh, well, you can just leave. And that's not supportive. That is not understanding the survivor. It is not helpful at all. And this is one of the reasons sometimes survivors don't come forward and say what's going on. They keep it to themselves because anytime they say something, someone is blaming them. Why you stay? Why don't you leave? If it's me, I'm gone already. That's not the right answer for a survivor of domestic violence.
Oh, thank you, Mariama. And the three of you are weaving together such important pieces to the story because it's not so simple. It's so complex. Why didn't she just leave? If it was that easy, everyone would just leave. But the way that the three of you are linking being trauma informed, attending to difference in culture and diversity, thinking about intersectionality and different identities and how they come together, and thinking about our own role as service providers or as neighbors, people in the community, and being sensitive to people's experiences that are very different from ours. And so I think what you just illustrated is so profound and so important. And I'm thinking, recently I was doing an interview with a survivor, and she was an immigrant. She was from Mexico, and she was a trans woman, and she came to the US undocumented. And the violence that she experienced was individual, but it was also so systemic as well, too, because on one hand, she couldn't get a work visa. On the other hand, she couldn't get a job. And then when she did get a job, it was either sex work or it was working in the beauty industry. But because she didn't have her documents, she had to go into sex work. And then this cycle continued, and the shame and the stigma. And it was one of the most complex cases that I had heard in a very long time because it was just so devastating. And then, essentially at the end, there was a remedy that she was able to get a visa. She came forward. There was a very complicated abusive past and that she was sort of dealing with. And then once she got out of this and she got the support that she needed, and she was able to get the services that she needed, get the visa, get housing, it was the most incredible thing because then she turned into support and advocacy. And I wanted to touch on this as well with you all too, because the resiliency and the strength of women, when we talk about violence and trauma, we just throw these words around, but this is really some of the most difficult and horrific and traumas and experiences of violence. And yet so many women come out of this still resilient, ready to help others, to take care of others, take care of their children, take care of friends. And I kind of wanted to open up, especially as we're drawing here towards sort of the end, this role of resilience. And I know that all of us have seen some of the most incredible resilience and stories that will stay with us for the rest of our lives. I just wanted to open it up to you all as well to comment on this, the role of resilience in sort of lives with survivors.
I feel you looking at me. I feel I feel that even though, not to get all philosophical, but like humanity isn't like the, I don't know, the shiniest experience, but I do think that resilience, for whatever reason, every survivor I've met, it's kind of been an inherent to them. And when I think, I mean, Sarah, your story about that client who not only met violence and oppression and abuse on an individual level, but also a systemic level. I think historically we see that there is something about this combination of dealing with violence in this way, or maybe it's just the stories of those who like survive it, of those who survive it, continuing to survive and thrive, that like builds this mythos around it. But it makes me think about the fact that as a client or a survivor who's an immigrant, a client or a survivor who is born here, it's not just like a lack of knowledge of the system, right? It's that the system is sort of kind of designed not to work out for lots of us. I'm not being a conspiracy theorist, but it's just like, it's not. It's fragmented. The services are all over the place. There are very few places that you can go to receive guidance around how to access the service, the right constellation of services that you need, that's going to allow you to kind of like put up this ladder that lets you climb out of this hole that's made deeper by all of the experiences of oppression and violence and abuse that you've undergone. And I often think about how a survivor's resiliency is like, in spite of the fact that the system is not, it's not designed to work in the way that you would think, which also goes back to the question of like why someone won't leave. Someone that, you know, a lot of times people don't leave because already we're kind of like fed this myth of where we are being the land of opportunity, right? And really the case is that everywhere you turn, depending on how you identify, you may be facing barriers to access. We're not even talking about opportunity yet, just like barriers to accessing whatever it is that you need in order to provide you help and assistance. I think that one great thing, not to toot the economic empowerment program's horn, but one great thing about it is like the fact that we focus on that, right? Like what does that access to opportunity look like? And also what's the math that's going to keep someone safe? Because it's amazing that, you know, we have survivors that have this resiliency despite their experience of harm and abuse and trauma. But I feel like that brings in, like, it calls upon us all to take some responsibility. And like, if they feel like they can survive for just a little bit longer, we have to think about the things that we can do to help them to survive longer than that. I mean, for as long as I've been working with survivors, there's been an immense amount of courage, but I think it's also important to note that battery, if it's continued to be beaten down by these larger systems, aside from the individual engagement, people don't have they just don't have happy endings, and the responsibility lies with all of us to figure out what's the part that we can play in helping, because this is literally this blight, you know, domestic violence, IPV, gender-based violence. None of us are safe from this. We could turn around tomorrow and it's there. So like, what does that, like, what's the call to action then?
Thank you, Sarah. So beautifully stated. Mariama, Jennifer, any thoughts?
I'm going to go micro and think again about the one-on-one interaction, right? I think I tend to go that way when I feel daunted by the overwhelming flaws in the system. Mm-hmm. But I think that given all that it takes and all of the hoops that people need to go through to get out of difficult situations, what we can give to each other is noticing those steps, right? And to me, I think resilience is reinforced and supported by us noticing, oh my God, you showed up today. That's so great. Or I noticed you found a babysitter for your kids so you can go to work. That's amazing. Like those small things. It's not all of a sudden, I'm really happy, I feel great. It doesn't happen that way. It happens with very small steps. And so we can help build resilience in each other and hope people do that for us by by connection, by noticing what's going on and how people are making those steps, because there are so many of them for our clients.
Thank you, Jennifer. So many steps. Mariama.
I think, Sarah, do you want to see if anyone from the attendees has a question, or before we continue? Or can I just jump in?
Yes, go ahead, jump in, and I'll start moderating some of the questions in the chat. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
For me, survivors of gender-based violence are the most resilient individual ever, for me. Because you can see a survivor victim with minimum resources, but they have that strength, something inside that making them get up every single morning and do ton of things, miracles that I can't do at all, right? So they have something there. I think we service providers, we just need to find a finger, put a finger on it. How can we support them so that they can reach the goals they have, right? If I think about a client like the trajectory, and that again, doesn't matter where you're from. I'm going to give you one example. One of my clients who had an amazing job, an executive somewhere, has a huge apartment in New York, but has a beach house. So of course, she has all the resources, but what she went through with the family law issues, like family court, was awful. It was horrible. For 3 years, she was in court to get custody of her children. And the community, the building where they live, people were not talking to her because of what the abuser told them, even though they knew her, right? She herself felt isolated, but she found something that could help her every single morning and keep her battle, because it was a battle. And in the end, she saw the fruits, like she had a goal and she reached the goal. So for me, they are the most amazing human beings I have ever seen my whole life.
Thank you, Mariama. And I love what you said, that you've never seen someone more resilient than a survivor of domestic violence. And I think we can all agree, because for all the reasons that you just said. So thank you so much for sharing that. And then we'll open up to any questions. And as we're sort of filtering questions, I think as we're getting to this in our conversation, but it's always helpful as we wrap up these discussions and we're starting to talk about this a bit more, but what can we do in terms of, as a community, as listeners, how can we kind of continue this idea of being accountable to one another, not just as service providers, but as neighbors, as a friend, as a neighbor, as a colleague, and just some thoughts that you might have around flagging this for folks. So maybe today, if someone can walk away and say, okay, this is something I can do. I've heard someone who's been talking about this. I'm concerned that they're in a domestic violence situation. My colleague at work has said these things that are problematic. So, just in terms of some next steps, I think this would be a nice time to bring that up.
Next step. I love that question, Sarah. Next step. I think we all have a responsibility or responsibilities around this. This is not a problem for one individual. This is a community issue. This is a worldwide issue. So because it is a worldwide issue, we need a worldwide response here. And when I say worldwide, it's like everyone needs to know they should be held accountable. If you know something is going on, you don't say nothing, you don't help, you should be held accountable. I think we have been doing a lot of outreach education at Sanctuary for Families, and I'm really thankful for that because we can bring these resources in the community. But I think we need more than just outreach and education, educating people about what is it, how it happened, what the services are. Well, we need to criminalize it. We need to hold perpetrators accountable, and communities or society need to realize that they have a role to play. One individual can never end it. We coming from a very far away, right? I'm very thankful about the movement. I'm very thankful to people who saw this as a problem and started it maybe before we were all born. Wonderful. But we still have these problems. So that means there is something that is not right. So question mark, what is not right there?
Mariama, you remind me of, I remember doing a presentation for a like Fortune 500 company who wanted to take on interns from the economic empowerment program. And one of the individuals at this comically large conference room table said, well, what do you do about the fear that like an abuser is going to show up at the door and come in and be violent? And I'm like, well, what do you do about it now? Do you think that there are individuals who work here who aren't survivors of domestic violence? The stat is 1 in 3. That doesn't mean that you have the other 2 only working here. To your point, part of the challenge is that we do have to accept that this is a thing that happens for more people than we can even fathom, right? The stat doesn't effectively do it. You have to like think of yourself and your 2 close friends and remind yourself that one of you has experienced domestic violence and the other 2 of you don't know. So, you know, in when that's the case, I think that key to like, what's the community accountability? I think I would love to see more community-based organizations, not professional organizations, just like community groups asking for more kind of like in services about what DV is, understanding that a third, you know, or a significant amount of the population of individuals that they're connecting with are touched by this issue, that they can be touched by this issue, and that the ways that they are touched by this issue is either heightened or broadened or deepened based on how they identify, right? So, you know, if you're a person who is more likely to, you know, have a deeper impact or experience of oppression, domestic violence on top of that is going to make it all the more harder for you to pull yourself out of that. And I think that we need to be talking about this more, that, you know, abuse and violence remains in the dark so easily because people are very, very uncomfortable with the idea of victimhood. Almost like they're afraid that if they start talking about it, that somehow it's going to find them, when in truth, we are all equally vulnerable to the experience, right? So figuring out how to become more comfortable discussing this so that when someone brings up something that seems like it's a flag, you can figure out a way to move through, like process through the concern that you would have for like your own self-preservation and not wanting to kind of like contract victimhood, to then move to the place where you can be like, that was interesting that you said that. Like, what did you mean by that? And kind of like help someone else dig into that a little bit more, and to provide that kind of that listener's ear that Jennifer was you know, spoke about so eloquently. But yeah, it's a weird juxtaposition that like so many people would be so afraid to talk about this stuff, but also very quick to like ask, why would someone leave? Like why won't someone leave? Like it's that easy to actually deal with when it's so challenging to actually talk about.
Thanks, Sarah. And I really like what you said about not to shy away from these conversations, and that when people start to say these words that are concerning, that to follow through and to say, okay, well, what's been going on? But and they're not going to catch domestic violence by listening to somebody. It's not going to be the case. And I have a couple of questions here that I just wanted to open up to from Clayton. I think it's also about not knowing what the first step might be for people who are or may never see themselves in a DV situation. Does one call 911 when the officers show reverence to the abuser? That's a good question. Does one call the 1-800 number and not knowing what's going to happen to their children? Does one not call a family lawyer knowing not how much it costs? So yeah, there's a lot of structural concerns that Clayton is bringing up here. And I think, between the four of us, we all have an answer to this, and it can be tricky to call 911. I think it depends if you're an immigrant who's undocumented, calling 911, you may not get the help that you need on the other line. And that is an unfortunate reality. I invite anyone else as well to jump in to respond to this question.
I definitely think if there is an imminent danger, right, to a victim or survivor or the children, the first thing to do is calling 911, because hoping that they will show up at least for that time. We don't know what's going to happen when they take the report. We have experiences that are just out of, like, unbelievable, right? But I think there are so many people out there who are willing to do this work for free. I think no one should be held because of the cost it's going to, like the cost that's going to be involved, right? Like if I think about Sanctuary for Families, and there are tons of NGOs there working with survivors, reach out to these people. You have a team that's going to work with you. You don't have to navigate this by yourself, because it is a very tricky, complicated process. It is difficult. But again, just to highlight, we do services for free, Sanctuary. We don't charge no one else. And there are many people out there. And that's the number one to go to. So you have a counselor, you have a therapist, you're going to have someone who can support you emotionally and make suggestions for you, give you all the information you need so that you can make an informed decision.
And Mariama, that happens. Many people don't understand that, like, when you call a domestic violence hotline, it's not that someone is whisking you away to shelter right that second and picking you up in an unmarked car. Like, there's time to plan, there's time to process, there's time to think about what the best option is for you. There are so many survivors I've met who have called Sanctuary just for economic empowerment services because they didn't know that they could call just for information, right? So, and yes, the important crisis hotline information has just been shared in the chat. That is really the wealth of the resource, is that you can speak to somebody who has an understanding of violence and abuse and talk with them about what your concerns are, what shelter is like, what are options aside from shelter, what options there are around orders of protection or doing something else, or how do you keep yourself safe when the cops aren't an option? Like, all of this stuff can be talked through based on someone's individual context.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm a real proponent of just gathering information. And I think that's a really important thing, to feel empowered with information. And I think calling an agency or going to a website of some place like Sanctuary, or there's lots of other ones, right, where this is what people do all the time. They're going to be able to advise you, and no one can pressure you to do things. You're just gathering information. For me, it's like trying a new allergy medication or something. You want to do research. You need to talk to people, and you have to figure out what you want to do. But I think it does feel scary. And the other thing I did want to say, I saw a comment about children. Often with clients we work with, it's because they want to keep their children that they end up leaving. Because actually, if they stay and they're in a domestic violence situation, that puts the whole family at greater risk of having intervention from outside services. So often it's the wanting to be with their kids and keep custody and stay as the main parent, the lead parent, that helps people make a decision. And there too, it can help to gather information and start a paper trail.
Great. Thank you, Jen, and bringing in all those dimensions and the fact that these services are available. And even more so, we have, and you mentioned there's several organizations, Sanctuary is just one, but then you have organizations, well, in New York City, I'll use AVP, that specifically works with survivors who are identifying with the LGBTQ+ community to get specialized services for those folks. And if you're also an immigrant, you're undocumented, Sanctuary is one, but there's many other immigrant organizations that serve in particular survivors of domestic violence. So you have these very specialized organizations that are supporting survivors with various identities, which I think makes it a lot safer for folks to approach these different groups. So this is great. So thank you so much. And thank you for the great questions. I see all the information is on the chat posted there for folks as well to follow up. Yeah, this is terrific. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, our fireside chat panelists, for sharing your resources, your talent, your advocacy with all of us. This was an incredible conversation, and this is just the start. I hope that we all utilize this opportunity to continue these conversations, not only with this community, but with our community at home as well. We also have a few additional housekeeping announcements for you all. As you can see here, we dropped the direct donation link to Sanctuary for Families. All of the donations we did receive on Eventbrite will be donated to them, but if you would like to also donate directly to their website, you can do so, and you can connect with them on Instagram at SFFNY. And a few additional FYLI announcements. Our cohort 4 mastermind is having open applications. You can actually apply on our website. I will drop it here in the chat for you. And you can connect with us on Instagram at FYLI Tribe, and I'll connect that with you here as well. And also we have another exciting active listening conversation next week with Wheeled Community, our Wheeled Community Spotlight. It is free and open to the public. We'd love for you to share it with your communities. We hope to see you there. And I'll pass it over to our co-founders, Summer and Jacqueline, for additional announcements.
Yes, thank you so much. I just want to say I learned so much personally, and I hope everybody here also walked away with some great and profound knowledge. And thank you so much for everybody's time. And I will pass it to my co-founder, Jax.
I just want to say thank you to our incredible speakers and partners for this evening and all of the work that you do. This means so much for us. Everyone listening in, I hope you reach out, support, donate, get involved, and spread the message about their work. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We will send a recap of the conversation and a recording so that everyone has the information accessible. And if you want to connect more directly with any of the organizations or speakers, please reach out to us. And thank you.
Hope to see you all again very soon.
Thank
Bye,
you, everyone.
ladies.
Have a wonderful evening.
Bye.